Okay, so Mansfield Park. Virginia Woolf said that of all great writers, Jane Austen is the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness. A lovely quote from her. And while that applies to all of Jane Austen's works, I think it perfectly sums up the reading experience of Mansfield Park in particular. You can say, of all the great novels by Jane Austen, Mansfield Park is the most difficult to catch in that act of greatness. And of all the brilliant characters drawn by Jane Austen, Fanny Price is one of the most difficult to catch in that act of greatness. I came to this book not sure what to expect because so many people hate this book. They feel frustrated with it mainly because they dislike the heroine. But at the same time, so many people said that this was their favorite book from Jane Austen, so mixed reviews there. And having finished it recently, I can confidently say that this is one of the most subtle and understated works by Jane Austen, and in my opinion, the most ambitious of her novels so far. I say so far because if you haven't been following my channel for the past couple of weeks, I'm on something of a Jane Austen binge. I'm reading all of her works in a chronological order, in the order they were written, not necessarily published. So far, I have read Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and I had read Pride and Prejudice before, so I decided to skip it this time round, and now recently I have finished Mansfield Park. Because I think this book is different from the previous two novels that I read from Jane Austen, I think it deserves a different type of review, and because I found that I had so much to say about it, actually too much to be packed in one video, I decided to cut this review in two parts. In this part one, I'm going to talk about some of my thoughts about the book in general, and also I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into the character of Fanny Price herself. And in the second part of this review, I'm going to talk more about all the other characters and touch a little bit on some of the themes and ideas that the novel raises. Once part 2 is ready, I'm going to link it in the cards above and also in the description box below. Now, the premise of this book, if you're familiar with it, please feel free to skip this section. There will be timestamps in the description box. But the idea here is that the heroine Fanny Price is the daughter of a large but not very well-off family. And we are told that her mother, long before the beginning of the novel, had ruined her life by marrying a sailor against the wishes of her family, and for that reason she is somewhat estranged from them. Fanny's mother has two sisters, one that we come to know by the name of Lady Bertram because she is the wife of a baron, Sir Thomas Bertram, and the owner of Mansfield Park. The other sister is Mrs. Norris, who married a clergyman and lives in Mansfield near the Bertrams. Now you might think Fanny Price is the main character of this book, but let me tell you that Mrs. Norris is definitely the star of the novel. I think I'm going to dedicate a whole long section completely for Mrs. Norris in my next video. But anyway, the Bertrams and Mrs. Norris decide at one point to help out the sister, Fanny's mother, and the way they want to help her is by adopting one of her children. The one they choose is Fanny. And Fanny is about 10 years old at the time she moves to Mansfield to live with the Bertrams. Because Fanny is uneducated and comes from a poor family, there is a concern that she might be a bad influence over her cousins, and also another concern that one of the Bertram boys might fall in love with her. And to avoid that, Sir Thomas and Mrs. Norris decide on a way of dealing with Fanny, which they describe as caring for her, educating her, and doing their best to make sure she grows up to be a fine young lady, but at the same time making sure that she never forgets where she comes from or who she is. She should never ever come to think of herself as being on the same level as her cousins. Of course, what that translates into in practical terms is complete negligence of her wants and needs, condescension by her cousins at best, and horrid treatment from her dear Aunt Norris. The years pass and we meet the cast again when Fanny and her cousins are grown up to be young ladies and gentlemen. And it is then that really the meat of the story starts to unravel. Things become a bit more complicated with the arrival of Henry and Mary Crawford, two siblings from London, and their arrival on the scene really adds spice and variety to the world of Mansfield. And then in a typical Jane Austen fashion, we follow the young people around in their life as they try to find out who they are and their position in life, whether by choosing a profession or a spouse, and everything else that comes with that, the adventures, the love stories, the love triangles, and at one point I think the love quadruples. Okay, so the first thing that struck me about this book is that there is here more of that delicious irony and biting criticism than in any of the other works from Jane Austen that I had read before. The narrator here is absolutely merciless, ruthless towards the characters, and Even early on, I thought that the narrator was being very mean or even a bully towards the characters, but very soon I realized that this book has a tone of no-nonsense. People, all the characters would get called out on their nonsense, at least on the textual, narrative, linguistic level, and they would be made fun of relentlessly because of it. As with all Jane Austen's works, this is done in a way that does not make you really hate the character, and even if you hate them, it's not that annoying kind of hatred. But anyway, because of this tone, the book seemed to me a bit more serious than the previous ones, and as I read on, it definitely proved to be less silly than Northanger Abbey or Sense and Sensibility. I don't know, did it strike you in the same way, or do I have the wrong impression for some reason? Let me know in the comments below. But what I'm trying to say is that this is not an unfunny book, it's a funny one, but the kind of comedy is not based on mock scenes or hilarious misunderstandings and awkward moments, even though there are some cringy moments, especially thanks to the presence of the oblivious Mrs. Norris, but usually the comedy is achieved at the expense of the characters and due to Austen's genius way with words and her beautiful, delicious irony. Also, the things that the book talks about or deals with made it seem more serious to me, more ambitious at least, and larger in scope than the previous works. If you saw my last video on Sense and Sensibility, you might remember that I said there were quite a few dark aspects to that book. There were things related to the seduction of a 15-year-old and illegitimate children and other stuff, but you come away from that book not really focusing on those things. But here in Mansfield there are quite a few of those things, and they stare you in the eye. And they take a broader perspective. For example, the issue of slavery and the slave trade is directly mentioned in Mansfield Park and is there at the heart of Mansfield Park itself, and there is no going around it. You can even argue that Fanny's situation in that family is one of a slave, and her relationship with her aunts is a relationship between a slave and her masters. Also, Fanny's treatment by her foster parents, and especially by Mrs. Norris, is really, really terrible. I mean, you can make the case that it borders on child abuse. And even if you hate Fanny or don't like her, think about her as a submissive, prudish, weak character, even after you watch the comment section in this video in which I try to defend Fanny and hopefully convince you otherwise. But if you insist on thinking of her that way, at least you have to excuse whatever you dislike about her as the result of her really horrible childhood. Less disturbing but still very important and quite difficult to grasp is the issue of morality, especially with regards to the whole debate between nature versus nurture. Are the baddies really condemned to a life of immorality or amorality forever? Or can they be redeemed by the presence and the influence of the good ones in the book? Is morality linked to country life as opposed to city life? If it is, then it's not as clear-cut as you might think. And whatever the relationship between the two, what does it say about the increasing migration from the countryside to the city and the invasion of the countryside by city dwellers? All of these things are raised by the book, and they need some kind of deliberation and contemplation to really get what the narrative of the story is trying to say about all of those issues. Now, disclaimer, I titled this section More Ambitious and More Socially Engaged, not because I think the rest of Austen's works are not socially engaged. I think all of her works deal very much with social issues, but what struck me most in this book is that they are dealt with in a more direct manner, and the book is more active in that engagement. Okay, so moving on. From all of this, perhaps you can tell that this will not be the most romantic story from Jane Austen. Actually, I think it is the least romantic story from Jane Austen, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why people don't like it as much as they like the others, but it doesn't bother me a lot because there is so much else going on in this book. And there is enough flirtations and love interests and witty dialogues to satisfy me, especially whenever the Crawfords come onto the scene, because they add that something of sexiness and charm and style. One more thing that might seem weird is that the vast majority of events that take place in this book do not happen to Fanny directly, and she has no role in them beyond that of the spectator or the observer. Everyone is actively engaged with their lives, doing things or at least saying something, but Fanny is just sitting being silent and waiting. I mean, for more than 2/3 of the book, you can cut out Fanny completely, and still very little would change to the story itself. And I guess this is another thing that disappoints readers who come to Mansfield Park expecting to meet a character like Elizabeth Bennet or even Catherine Morland, someone who's going on adventures and falling passionately in love and doing stuff, but instead they get this character which the largest portion of the book could very easily do without, at least story-wise. But the reason this doesn't bother me and doesn't seem strange to me is because I view this book not merely or not even mainly as the story of Fanny Price, the way Pride and Prejudice is basically the story of Elizabeth Bennet. Mansfield Park is the story of Mansfield Park. It is as much the story of the Bertrams and the Crawfords as it is the story of Fanny. I mean, the story of Jane and Bingley figures very prominently in Pride and Prejudice, but at the end you know that Pride and Prejudice is basically the story of Lizzie and Darcy. But here in Mansfield Park, it's not like that. It is the story of the whole family situated in that broader context of issues that I have been talking about. And in that whirlpool of moral confusion and ambiguity, we have Fanny Price, who is like an anchor in the world of the novel, someone who remains true and steadfast to her principles and to what she believes is right all throughout the novel. Considering everything, I think she is an exemplary character of strength, resilience, intelligence, and kindness. So let's talk about Fanny. If you separate a 10-year-old from her family, take her miles away, and tell her that now she's going to be living with strangers, relatives that she knows nothing about, you wouldn't be much surprised if the child cries a little bit, throws a tantrum every now and then, and is quite sulky. I mean, they need just a little bit of time to adjust. While Fanny does none of these things. She is just a bit sad and a bit shy. And for only that, she is told that she is being ungrateful because she did not express her utter happiness at her own luck. I mean, imagine that, a 10-year-old not realizing their luck to be separated from their parents and thrown away to be living with strangers who scold them. Yeah, unbelievable. And Fanny, all throughout her childhood, she was treated with neglect and even, especially from Mrs. Norris, with cruelty. She was constantly reminded that she is not on the same level as her fabulous cousins, and she was always told to think of herself as the last and the lowest in the family. And Fanny learns that lesson all too well. Her insignificance and inferiority are internalized. She accepts and understands that she is less worthy than her cousins and the rest of the family. Fast forward a few years and we meet Fanny, and we see her as a quiet, gentle young woman. She doesn't like to talk much, but she is a very good listener. I guess in today's lexicon, she would be described as an introvert. She respects her foster parents and feels grateful to them and overlooks their negligence of her because, I mean, who is she to be attended to? She even likes to please her Aunt Norris despite the horrible way she treats her, and I think it is from here that most objections to Fanny's character arise, as submissive and weak. I mean, why doesn't she stand up for herself and just not take Mrs. Norris's bullshit anymore? Well, for one thing, I don't think she sees anything particularly wrong in the way she is being treated, perhaps with the exceptions of a few really mean remarks from Mrs. Norris. I think she is smart enough to know that indeed she has been very lucky to be brought up and living in Mansfield Park, compared to what she would have had to put up with had she stayed with her parents. Her life now is very comfortable and she enjoys it. Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram have been very kind to her in admitting her to their house and giving her food and shelter and education and everything else. So what more claims can she have on their goodwill? That they don't treat her the same way they treat their own children? Well, she can hardly expect that, especially considering her upbringing. As I read on, and when I saw how Fanny deals with all types of hardships in her life, I thought that she very reasonably prefers to endure in silence. She doesn't like to draw so much attention to herself, which is perfectly valid and even commendable. What's more, she likes to be useful to others. I think she has this almost stoic philosophy of not expecting much from the world and from others, being content with what she actually does have, and exhibiting great strength and resilience and endurance in times of hardships. Again, I think this is the result of her childhood, the outcome of that tension or dichotomy between feeling inferior to others in her current situation, but at the same time being grateful for that very situation because she would have been, objectively speaking, much worse off without it. So the outcome is that attitude of accepting your situation with intention. Also that attitude or that feeling that the world does not owe you anything for granted. You have to work to get what you get, and that you have to have the strength to endure difficulties. Mind you, this is very different from passive submission to your situation in life or passive submission to the will of others. Why am I sure of this? Again, I think Fanny is smart, and she knows that if she were to fight back and answer and try to silence her Aunt Norris, she wouldn't gain much from that. Well, not anything of value to her anyway. It would only make her life needlessly more difficult and without much gain. But when the time comes for her to push back, not to be bullied into something that she does not believe in, she shows great determination and courage. And this is not only in that very big moment when everyone was pressuring her to marry someone that she does not love nor even respect, but it's apparent all throughout the book. But let's talk about that one big moment for a minute. She gets a proposal that she is supposed to be on cloud 9 for receiving because she would never ever dream of receiving such a proposal in her life. Sir Thomas tries to pressure her into accepting the proposal, going as far as scolding her as being ungrateful, whimsical, unreasonable girl. And even though that wounds her very much, and she does not like Sir Thomas to think of her that way, she would not do something that she does not believe in. Even Edmund and her brother William, even though they do not actively pressure her into accepting the proposal, they see it as desirable and they regret the fact that Fanny finds herself unable to accept. But she remains true to her feelings and her principles, and she emerges out of the whole experience triumphant. Fanny may have internalized her inferiority and submitted to it, but that is only on the social level. And I think that is natural and even healthy because, after all, she is a Price, she is not a Bertram, and the sooner she accepts that fact about herself, the easier her life is going to be. But she does not doubt for a second her self-worth and her belief in her judgment of what is right and what is proper. She is very perceptive, very observant, and very intelligent. And like she said at one point in the novel, she may have been silent, but she has not been blind. Fanny can see, and she can see better than all of the rest of the characters in this book. While everyone was taken away by Henry's manners and charm, she saw him for what he is right from the beginning until the very end, not wavering for one moment, and was never blinded by his charm and his allure like all the others. The same goes for Mary. Fanny was the only one who could see that something in her eyes or in her smile which betrayed her flawed morality or immorality, or at least impropriety. And she was the only one who could see the transgressions of the young Bertrams and the Crawfords, even though everyone was there and everyone could have seen it, but nobody had the insight that Fanny had. I think this is going a bit long, so I don't want to get into any more details, but the last thing I want to mention is that what she saw at Southerton when they were going around the park and what was confirmed in the rehearsals of their play are really the foundations for her refusal to take part in it. Again, a refusal that she stood fast by despite all the pressure from the others, including Edmund. Yes, a play would have been improper for a family like the Bertrams, and that alone would have been sufficient justification for Fanny's refusal to take part in the play. I know a play doesn't seem like such a big deal for us nowadays, but you have to take into consideration the viewpoints and the traditions of the historical period. Also, performing such a play and doing such a thing in the absence of the head of the family, who could be in danger overseas, is also very improper. And out of respect for Sir Thomas, again, I think Fanny would be justified in disproving the play. But Fanny could see even beyond that. She could see that the play was used to disguise the flirtations and the transgressions that the Bertrams and the Crawfords were indulging themselves in. Because she saw that such indulgence could have serious consequences. And it did have serious consequences. She was right. And so even though she wished that the play would take place for her own amusement, she would not approve of it nor take a role in it sticking fast by her decision despite everything else. In the end, Fanny commands the respect of Sir Thomas Bertram and Lady Bertram, for whom she becomes almost indispensable. She proves to be useful to her own family, but particularly to Susan. Even the Crawfords want her company and love. To what degree of sincerity or depth of feeling, that might be open for debate, but they wanted her friendship nonetheless. And so when there is no need for resistance and fighting, Fanny likes to endure in silence, and she likes to be useful and kind to others. But when the stakes are high and she is forced or finds herself forced to do something against her better judgment, she shows great determination and courage, and in the end always proves herself to be on the right side. She can see people for who they are. She is never deceived by appearances, and when everyone else was losing their way and their head, she remained true to what she believed was right and proper. And on top of it all, she was constantly and always useful and kind and generous towards others. I mean, if that is not strength, then I really do not know what is. The only quibble you might have with her character is that she does not talk. As Austen would put it, I guess, she would not be prevailed upon to utter a word. But this is often done in a very funny way, and it allows for funny remarks on the part of the narrator, something along the lines of, Fanny was silent after a question, and then she suddenly realizes that she is expected to answer back, and so she mumbles so and so, something like that. But anyway, being a non-talker myself, I find it all right. Don't get fooled by my rambling ons to the camera. In real life, I barely say anything except to the people that I feel very, very comfortable with, and those are very few. And the question that I hate the most is when people ask me, why are you so quiet? So I wouldn't subject poor Fanny to the same kind of torture by questioning her silence. And so that is my take on Fanny Price and Mansfield Park. What do you think? Do you agree with me, or are you one of those people who are disappointed and frustrated by Fanny's character? If you belong to that second group, I hope that I have at least given you something to reconsider. If not, well, I understand this may not be everyone's cup of tea. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinions. As I said in the beginning of this video, part 2 of this review will be coming up very soon. Once it's ready, I'm going to be linking it in the cards above and in the description box below, but if you want to make sure that you don't miss it, then please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications bell. If you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up. It would be nice to know that you watched it and liked it. And finally, if you have been watching so far, thank you and cheers.